So thanks, everybody. Just a heads up on this. This I want it to be an article. I've been fighting it for many years now, and I made it my IAVS talk because I was hoping that this would kind of push me towards the end, but it's actually like pushing me towards a meltdown. So this is very much still a work in progress, and you'll see with the methodology, it's a bit weird. And so if you would like to, I totally welcome any kind of feedback, advice on where you think I should take this, especially methodologically. Originally, I was thinking about triangulating, but I just ran out of time for this conference. But anyway, so this is kind of building off of a larger project of mine. In 2001, I published a book called Animals in Irish Society. And this was a sort of small argument in that book that I felt needed to be expanded a little bit more. So I'm going to try my best to do this succinctly. But basically, the idea here is that I'm looking at this concept of animalization and the role it plays with modern vegan politics, but specifically I'm looking in the context of colonialism. So as we know, as critical animal studies folks, most societies are very, very dependent on systematically exploiting non-human animals. Veganism, as Kate was just mentioning, is very important because it disrupts this traditional narrative. And so what it does then is it forces species as institutions, nation states, to sort of reckon with that narrative. That may be, if they're powerful enough that means just ignore it. But if the vegan message gets loud enough and sticks around long enough, at some point they're going to have to respond. And so that's why this particular study, I'm looking at some discourse around that. When we're looking at newly developed nation states like Ireland, which has only been around for about 100 years, it's very, very new. It's a little bit more precarious for them. So historically, they have relied on non-human animals as a form of global participation, to be seen as a legitimate nation state. And so it seems that animal agriculture, in particular in this case, is presumed mandatory. And the other thing that's unique to a lot of post-colonial spaces is this history of animalization, colonialist racialization. Race very much so is a construction of the colonial project. And so we have to be thinking about how non-human animals also inform that, because what is race? But race is very much so about presumed cognitive difference, physical difference, evolutionary stuntedness, etc., the same type of things that we put on non-human animals. So I wanted to look at this sort of weird kind of mix of race, species, colonialism, and how veganism can kind of draw that out, if only implicitly. So this draws on a larger body of work on animal nationalism. I have a big boatload of citations down here, but there's many, many more. But basically, the idea of nationalism is that animality is deeply relevant to defining national and cultural identities. And many, many examples, which I don't have time to do in this short presentation. But there's research done in Africa, Asia, and I think definitely some in, I actually don't know if we have any on South. Yeah, we do actually have some in South America as well. And then, of course, my book on Ireland, because we forget about Ireland, is this one in the middle, because we consider Irish people today to be white, but historically they were not seen as white. So anyway, what we see in this case is that animality is really relevant in a material way and also in a symbolic way. So the first being that colonization is often predicated upon the expansion of animal agriculture or other forms of animal exploitation. So for instance, in the US and Canada, the fur trade was one of the main reasons to kind of spark the expansion of settlers. But then, of course, the metaphorical bit is important here with the bit I mentioned earlier about animalization. So this idea that when you bring in speciesism, you bring in a new sort of structure, an ideological structure and a material structure, this idea that some are dominant, some are subservient, some can exploit, and some will be exploited, some are resources. And it becomes a material structure that changes the architecture of a space. But ideologically, it's very important as well when speciesism is introduced. And inevitably, what we also see with that is an expansion of animalization beyond non-human animals to include humans as well, which I'll mention in the next slide. So looking at Ireland, As we were talking about in the chat a little bit ago, I think Ireland is really interesting because of, the race politics there, obviously, but we don't really hear much about Ireland being in the middle of the US and the UK. A lot of the attention goes to those two larger countries. But Ireland is really the first major colonized country by Britain. Well, there was Wales, but when we had Great Britain, then Ireland was the big one. Ireland had been colonized for about 800 years. The English were involved with that. The Normans were involved with that. The Vikings were even involved with that. But primarily, we're looking at Britain as the main colonizer. And again, this is about expanding animal agriculture. We have, especially in industrializing Britain, there's this new need to feed the colonies, new need to feed factories and domestically. And so we see mass removal of people in the Irish countryside out of their homes, off of their land. Land was privatized. And then famously, of course, Irish people were forced into sort of diets of necessity, a sort of vegetarian diet of necessity, where it was a lot of obviously potatoes, but cabbages and other wild growing plants. And I talk about that more in my book, by the way, about this indigenous vegetarianism that I think a lot of us are not aware of in Ireland, where people really didn't eat a lot of animal products until colonialism shifted that. So how was this justified? Well, again, we see logics of race, logics of animality. So saying that Irish people were primitive, they were uncivilized, that they were just needed, they needed Britain to come in and uplift them and to control them. They were wild, they couldn't self-rule. They also specifically would refer to animality in many ways, that, like you see in this cartoon from a major British journal or magazine in the mid 1800s, that they lived with animals, that they didn't know how to properly domesticate and exploit non-human animals for animal-based agriculture, that they were eating a mostly vegetarian, even vegan diet. And that showed that they simply weren't properly civilized, and that justified British rule. So here comes animalization. That's a very big part of this. We see this, as I mentioned earlier, in lots of different colonial spaces where the people who were colonized were not thought to be fully human. There's a really fascinating book on this called Apes and Angels. If you might be able to flip through some of that on Amazon, I'm not sure. But it basically documents all these instances in the United States and in the UK where Irish people were Simonized. They weren't always turned into apes. Sometimes they were shown as other animals, but a lot of the times they would be made to look like chimpanzees. The idea being that they're not fully developed into proper human beings. So this was explicitly understood by the revolutionaries who were pushing back against this. So I don't want to paint Ireland as being this kind of passive space. They pushed back. In the Celtic revival towards the end of the 1800s, they were very much so aware of the fact that they were not fully seen as human. They weren't properly seen as Europeans. They certainly weren't really seen as white. So this language, or this concept of white fragility, which has been used to look at race politics in the United States, specifically looking at Black folks, I think is really interesting if we can apply that here. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that. But what we see then is an effort to reclaim Irishness as something distinctive. It is a race, they claim, a distinctive, superior race. So in fact, what you start to see is that the Irish people are shown as not just human, but superhuman. So a lot of the illustrations and the descriptions of Irish people was a way to not just uplift them, but put them over the average European person. And again, this is a reaction to what had been done the hundreds of years of colonialism. So this racial project is part of this larger Celtic revival, and I don't think a lot of people kind of pay attention to that. There's a lot of focus on literature and language, but there's a lot of archaeological, anthropological work to actually humanize Irish people in response to that animalization. So what we see then is that when Ireland achieves its independence about 100 years ago, these now people become full humans through eating meat, drinking milk, doing all these things that their colonizing oppressors had done before. Because if I was mentioning earlier with this sort of paucity of diet during colonialism, where folks didn't have enough to eat, they're just eating potatoes and cabbage. And so this sort of vegetarianism, forced vegetarianism, comes with it a bunch of shame. And I forgot to also to mention the fact that they were eating all that vegetarian food was seen as, you know, you're not fully developed as a human. And that's also been documented in other parts of the colonized world, such as in Asia, where people were eating rice, therefore they're not fully fledged humans. So it was very important then when Ireland achieved independence that it doubled down on that. It's like, we do eat meat, we do drink milk, and we do lots of it. And animal agriculture, although it was really introduced as a British, under British colonialism, now becomes something uniquely Irish. And this is not to say that the Irish people did not domesticate and exploit animals before, but it was a much different system and a much more sustainable system. And it's more of a dairy-based food way than it was meat-based. So now they have emerged from this animal-like colonial subject, and this sort of white fragility of the colonial shame, I think, is still sort of informing that. Now, why did I come to this before I start talking about my methodology? I was listening to quite a few interviews with Sandra Higgins, who runs Go Vegan World in Ireland. And she has this poster campaign, which it's on billboards, it's on buses, it's on bus stops. And she was very, very active in the Irish media, on television shows, radio broadcasts. And a lot of those programs invited people to call in and ask her questions or to debate her. And what I heard in a lot of those debates and a lot of those questions was this animal anxiety. Like, people would call in and say, "Don't you remember the Great Famine?" And she said, "Yeah, I remember, I know about it." And say, "Well, that's why we can't be vegan." Things like that. One caller called in and said, "Well, if we start eating vegan, we're going to de-evolve and become knuckle-dragging apes." And so in those podcasts and video television shows, I saw this animal anxiety. So that's where this is coming from. I'm not just kind of making it up. But then I kind of move it into my method, where I thought, well, I'll triangulate. I'll do a content analysis of these interviews, and then I'll pair it with some actual discourse on the ground. I did not have time to go and do all the work of Sandra Higgins, and she puts a bunch of her stuff on her website, which is what I was going to do. Instead, I just stuck with this discourse I found on boards.ie. And boards.ie, because Ireland's a very small country, it's less than 5 million people. A lot of people use boards.ie. It's just a chat board sort of forum. And back in 2017, when I started this project, I took one post that it really popped off and just downloaded all the comments. And then over the past year, I've started to actually analyze those. There's 342 posts altogether, and it spanned about a half a year of conversation. I use qualitative coding on that. And it responds to, by the way, this particular image that was spotted, and someone posted about it, and it sparked off a big debate. So I'm out of time now, but basically just wanted to say what I found was a lot of negativity and a lot of unclear posts as well, which is the nature of doing content analysis on discussion boards. But most of those I think were probably negative, but I just couldn't prove they were negative. And there was a lot of dismissiveness. And again, I don't have time to go through all of this, but what's important here for the purposes of the discussion afterwards is I really only found about 28 posts that talked about Ireland specifically. And a lot of that referred to just the superiority of Irish farming, or the sanctity of the Irish farmers who got us through the the difficult years of independence. And it's kind of a sacredness that is around Irish farming culture. There's a few religious comments about, the church, the hegemony of the church. They've declined, and that's why everything's going wild with these vegans. And a lot of people actually drew on vegans as being a little bit too religious, and they were wary of that. So people are not aware. There's a lot of controversy with the Catholic Church in Ireland. But yeah, I didn't really see much. Sorry, I don't have time to talk about the rest of that. I didn't really see a lot about animalization or animal anxiety per se. So I was interested if anyone had any ideas about how I might move forward methodologically with this. The only really bit on animalization I saw was that there was a big side debate on why people thought it was okay to eat some animals and not other animals. And there were kind of like these weird logics about we don't eat animals that are carnivores because I don't even remember the logic. It doesn't make sense. But obviously we do eat carnivores. We eat pigs, we eat certain fishes, et cetera, et cetera. So if anyone has any thoughts about how to research more on this idea of having anxiety about our relationship with animals in a post-colonial context, I'd be very interested in that. So I'll stop now. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Marie-Elyse Smith. I'm a PhD candidate from Griffith University, or Queensland, Australia. My research investigates the history of veganism in Australia from the 1970s to the 2020s. And today my presentation is about the prominence of non-human animal agriculture and how it shaped an Australian national identity centered on meat consumption, leading to the view of veganism as un-Australian in order to maintain the social, political, and economic power of the animal agriculture industries. Sorry, that skipped straight to the end. So I'd like to start off first by acknowledging the Yugambeh, Yagara, and Turrbal people, the traditional owners of the land that I live and work on. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Despite Australia being an increasingly diverse and multicultural nation, there's a wide array of behaviours and actions that can and have been deemed as un-Australian. Welfare recipients, Muslims, and sobriety during the holidays have all been considered un-Australian at one point or another. Our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, even called an overpriced sausage sizzle un-Australian in June of this year. In fact, sausage sizzles have symbolically become a microcosm of the Australian national identity. Defined by the sale of a sausage on a piece of bread, usually with extra toppings such as sauces or onions, sausage sizzles are often considered a key feature of Australian culture, particularly when they're used to raise money for charities. Fundraiser sausage sizzles at the popular hardware store chain Bunnings are extremely common on weekends. However, one particular sausage sizzle in 2020 subverted tradition by only providing vegan sausages.
Sorry, Mary. I'm just going to stop you because your slides aren't moving, so I want to make sure we can see your great presentation.
Is it on the un-Australian slide?
It's just on the title slide.
Oh.
Yes, good. Sorry, carry on.
No worries. So this vegan sausage sizzle very quickly gained significant online criticism and was immediately called un-Australian. This example really highlights the mainstream culture of meat eating within Australia that veganism subverts. In Being Australian, Narratives of National Identity, Katrina Elder states that one of the most stereotyped, out of date, and yet long-lived and most popular narratives of Australianness is that of the Aussie bloke. This Aussie bloke identity is a stereotype that many Australians, and probably people from other parts of the world, would be familiar with. White, normatively masculine, a big drinker, a strong Australian accent, and a proud meat eater. This idea of Australianness stems back to the 19th century, where Australia was commonly described as a working man's paradise because of the high wages that labourers earned, as well as the wide availability and cheapness of meat. Being Australian, at its most simplistic, is to be a citizen of this country. However, there's many ideas and narratives surrounding what it means to be Australian. These narratives are the building blocks of the Australian national identity. And while this national identity is socially constructed and can never truly represent the diverse and multifaceted realities of living in Australia, these ideas surrounding Australianness reveal both the desires and the fears of those that contribute to the process of creating this national identity. Elder makes the arguments that the narratives that build the Australian national identity emphasize whiteness, particularly non-indigeneity, masculinity, and heterosexuality. I'm extending this idea by arguing that the Australian national identity also promotes heavy meat consumption, and this is observable through the alienation of vegans as un-Australian. Across various societies, periods, and cultures, meat has long been held in high esteem. Meat in the pastoral industry were foundational in the colonization of Australia. The legacies of animal agriculture in the social, political, and economic development of the nation and the resulting reverence of meat led to heavy meat consumption being a key feature of the Australian national identity. The colonization and settlement of Australia after 1788 was based on the belief that it was the British colonizers' duty to seize the country from primitive inhabitants and properly cultivate it to British standards. Pastoralism thus became central to the economic growth of Australia, with wool becoming such a vital product in the development of the nation that it's commonly said that Australia was built on a sheep's back. Australian food historian Michael Symons has argued that the success of the pastoral industry turned Australia into a nation of meat eaters. The prominent pastoral industry resulted in meat being widely available and cheap in colonial Australia. The statement, "meat 3 times a day," became a slogan of sorts for one of Australia's main selling points during the early to mid-19th century. Journalist Richard Twopenny in 1883 described the Australian love of meat as, of course, meat is the staple of Australian life. A working man whose whole family did not eat meat 3 times a day would indeed be a phenomenon. Meat eating became integral to the Australian identity because of this pastoral industry. The influence was visible in national songs such as the iconic Waltzing Matilda, in which a swagman, a transient sheep shearer, grabs a jumbuck, a sheep, to eat. The 20th century brought the development of the large-scale, intensive factory farm-led production of animal agriculture. In the 1930s, a quarter of Australians were employed within the agricultural industry, and by the 1970s, agriculture only accounted for 1/10 of employment in Australia. By the 1980s, only 1/15 of the Australian population lived in rural areas. This decline is due to the transition of agriculture from being primarily small farms to capital-intensive agribusiness, arriving from policies aimed at making agriculture more efficient and more productive. While this intensification increased the yield of farms, it quickly halved the number of farmers and allowed large corporations to monopolize the market. While the number of farms and farmers has decreased, the centrality of meat eating in the Australian imaginary has not diminished, nor has the influence of the animal agriculture industry. Agriculture is a prominent and powerful industry, accounting for 55% of Australian land use. The gross value of animal agriculture in Australia is $34 billion. It's common for animal agriculture groups to make donations to political parties, and the Australian government also provides significant funding to various animal agriculture industry groups, including Meat and Livestock Australia, as outlined in the Australian Meat and Livestock Industry Act 1997. Historical, cultural, political, and economic significance upholds the perceived necessity of the animal agriculture industry and the importance of meat eating within the Australian national identity. To ensure the continuing power and profit of these industries, they aid in the creation of narratives of Australianness by reinforcing the idea that to be Australian is to eat meat. The long-running Meat and Livestock Australia campaign to promote Lamb on Australia Day is a perfect example of how the meat industry utilizes ideas of national identity and un-Australianness to reinforce normative meat consumption habits and increase profit. The first advertisement for this campaign aired in 2005, and it featured former footballer Sam Kekovich and heavily relied on themes of nationalism. The ad opened with...
We still can't see your screen.
Oh, really? Can you see it now?
Yes. But it was stuck on the first one again.
Oh, no. Okay, well, I think I'll change the way I'm switching the PowerPoints then. So the ad opened with an instrumental version of the Australian anthem, and Sam Kekovich sat in front of the Australian flag and stated, "There's nothing worse than being un-Australian. I'm sickened by the creeping tide of un-Australianism eroding our great tradition, like our custom of eating lamb on Australia Day." He then continued ranting against Australianism and states, "Do you think the diggers in the trenches were fighting for tofu sausages? No, they were thinking of grabbing a lamb chop off the barbie with their bare fingers, sustaining third-degree burns, and then sticking their hands in a relieving esky to fish out a cold one." This statement calls upon the symbolism of the Anzac legend, with the World War I soldiers, or diggers, being highly idealized in Australia and are widely considered to exemplify the characteristics of the Australian national identity. He then finished the ad by saying, "The soap-avoiding, pot-smoking hippie vegetarians may disagree with me, but they can get stuffed. They know the way to the airport, and if they don't, I'll show them. Don't be un-Australian. Serve lamb on Australia Day." This ad is essentially saying that you have to eat meat to be Australian, and if you don't like it, you should leave. With this sort of nationalistic rhetoric airing on television, it's no shock that the Cronulla race riots occurred later that year in Sydney. The Australia Day lamb ad, campaign is still running, and their 2024 ad centered on the premise that a love of lamb is the one thing that can connect the different generations and bridge the generation gap. While the more recent ads aren't quite as explicitly hateful towards people who don't eat meat, the messages of these advertisements still contribute to the otherisation of vegans within Australia. Hopefully this actually changes the slide. In recent years, veganism has repeatedly been referred to as un-Australian. The vegan sausage sizzle that I previously mentioned, vegan meat pies, and vegan activists have all been deemed by the public, as well as some quite powerful politicians, as un-Australian. As I've discussed, meat has been deeply ingrained within the economic, cultural, political, and social foundations within Australian society. The consumption of meat is such a clear part of the national identity of Australia that to abstain from meat is viewed as a rejection of Australian culture. Of course, there's also a lot to say about the ties between the Australian national identity, meat consumption, and gender specifically, but I don't have time to go into that today. The categorization of un-Australian has been utilized in the othering of those perceived as a threat to a hegemonic Australian national identity. Denouncing veganism as un-Australian contributes to the othering of vegans, creating a stance of us, meat eaters, and them, vegans. The boycotting of animal products is a threat to the norms of Australian society and the power of the animal agriculture industries. Ultimately, veganism rejects dominant cultural norms of a society based on the exploitation of animals and the planet for financial gain, which was arguably the entire basis for the colonization of Australia. By othering vegans and labeling veganism as un-Australian, the messages and meanings behind veganism are easily brushed aside, and the structures and systems within our society that support animal agriculture can continue on being accepted with no critical examination of the harm they cause. And lamb sales can keep increasing right before Australia Day. Thank you for listening.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Loredana. I'm a postdoctoral associate at the University of Miami, but I'm joining you today from New York City, so it's 5 a.m. here. Good to see you all in sunnier times. And so today I'm going to speak about my research with my colleague, Rachel Wetz at Brown University. Let them eat kale, class-based resentment in conservative opposition to climate action. So this is a bit of a gear shift from the previous presentations, looking a bit at how transitions to plant-based diets are used to stoke opposition to climate action. So I'll start with giving you a bit of background about what motivated this research. So basically, much of the literature on climate obstruction discourse focuses on the quasi-scientific, seemingly factual arguments used to promote climate action discourses. These are, of course, casting doubt on climate science and misinformation, also known as evidence skepticism, questioning the scientific process, also known as process skepticism, and contesting proposals to address the climate crisis. More recently, this is a more recent process, also known as response skepticism. So while these types of arguments have, without a doubt, been very important, a broad literature in political sociology and social psychology suggests that affective appeals to social identities are highly effective at swaying public opinion and spurring mobilization. But these have been less documented in this literature. However, they are noteworthy because research on public opinion and political behavior has shown that people's evaluation of political issues is seldom motivated by so-called cold cognitive assessments of facts, and instead they are based on identity commitments, social group affiliations, and emotional responses. So given this, it's very surprising that this very robust literature on climate obstruction suggests that the most prominent discursive strategies of this highly successful climate change counter movement appear to rely on cognitive and rational justifications and contestation of facts. So within this smaller literature that focuses on this kind of affective and emotional laden strategies, we have mostly a focus on right-wing populism and gender identities such as appeals to masculinity. And these work really well. So for example, right-wing populism works really well with climate obstruction because we substitute traditional targets of hostility, such as immigrants and other marginalized communities, with environmentalists and so on. The same with climate action advocates and climate action organizations. We can substitute them with the so-called bureaucracies of elites, which ties into the right-wing populism rhetoric. But ultimately, the idea is that right-wing populism in itself, it's not really connected to climate obstruction. It's rather an expression of hostility to liberal cosmopolitan elites rather than an engagement with the issue of climate change itself. Okay, so given this discrepancy between factual and effective arguments documented in the climate obstruction literature, the question we are investigating here is, to what degree do climate obstruction discourses rely on at least putatively logical and scientifically justifiable reasoning in arguing against climate action proposals? And to what degree do they leverage more intuitive, emotive appeals to audiences' social identities to sway their opinions through less rational means? And to answer this question, we are using and looking at dietary change as a form of climate action, a transition to plant-based diets. And the reason we chose this is because a growing literature shows that transition to plant-based diets is effective and immediately available to a form of climate action, at least immediately available to most countries that are the most responsible for the problem. But at the same time, we know that anytime that this kind of proposal is introduced, it's met with a lot of contentiousness, with backlash and resistance. And at the same time, it can elicit emotional responses from publics and stir up associations with social group identities. So our data is basically media coverage of climate change debates focused on the IPCC between 1989 and 2021. We're looking at both mainstream and conservative media outlets, both TV and print. And our methods are computational text analysis and qualitative analysis of text, as well as some quantitative analysis for trends over time. And the findings. So today I'm going to only show you the conservative media findings because of the time constraints. And I will start with showing you some of our findings. So in the conservative media themes that we discover, first of all, we find no evidence of fact-based appeals arguing that dietary change as a form of climate action is ineffective or inappropriate. So basically, they're not engaging with this in a serious matter. Instead, the discourse is characterized by appeals to class-based identities, especially populist-style appeals that motivated opposition to dietary change as a form of climate action through its association with liberal elites, which are presented as immoral through accusations of hypocrisy and corruption. And so we found three themes under this one: elites as corrupt, mockery of displays of liberal elite cultural capital, and climate skepticism. And I'm going to give you some examples of each. So the first one, class-based identity appeals, where environmental spokespeople are cast as corrupt and or hypocritical elites. And my first example is from Fox News from 2009. Here we see Al Gore being targeted, painted as a hypocrite for not changing his eating habits to coincide with climate action. So I'm going to read this quickly out. If you really want to save the planet, Al, why don't you put down the cheeseburgers and pick up your veggie burger? Time for maybe soy milk and tofu turkey. Here's another example, the Wall Street Journal, 2009. Again, here we see, you can notice how the Wall Street Journal underlines Gore's elite status, right, by pointing out his Nobel Prize and his hypocrisy by noting that the Nobel Prize winning global warming evangelist hasn't yet added vegetarianism to his climate prescriptions. And a final example in this category, we see from Fox News, is from 2019, we see how environmental leaders are depicted as members of the corrupt economic elite who are motivated by financial interests rather than genuine concern for the climate issue. And we see claims such as this one, again, targeting Al Gore, that the claim is that he benefits from this type of climate action, that he benefits from a transition to plant-based diets and from investing in these transitions. And he's being called a post-meat billionaire and so on. So the next category that we found, mockery of displays of cultural capital. Here we basically see kind of the tastes and diets of liberal elites being ridiculed and being called absurd. So the first example I'm going to give you is from Fox News again, where we see that Democrats are being ridiculed for their alleged climate-friendly food choices. And this quote is basically saying, as soon as the caucuses are over, Democrats will go back to trying to get Americans to eat soybeans and silkworms. That's not too bad if you deep fry them. So kind of like making fun of the whole thing. Another example from Fox News. Here we see how elites are portrayed as out of touch with, and removed from the needs of ordinary Americans who can only buy 2 burgers for $1, while the elites can buy the Beyond Meat burger, which is like $17. And finally, we also see this kind of mockery and immorality fused together and I'm giving you this quote because it's really amazing, and it's using this famously apocryphal quote to portray Democrats as modern-day Marie Antoinette. So I'm going to read this out quickly. Democrats have become the party of smug coastal elitism and everything that comes with it, and on food that makes them the party of veganism, artisanal arugula on a bed of even more artisanal arugula, and paying $27 for a small plate of aspic tuvalu on fusion cuisine. Let them eat kale. So we see again, like trying to like blend all these things, kind of making fun of the whole idea. And finally, the last theme that we found in conservative media was climate skepticism. And here is what's interesting is that so while the reality and severity of anthropogenic climate change is questioned, these claims here gain rhetorical force from their entwinement with identity appeals rather than being logically substantiated with factual or scientific evidence. And so again, an example from Fox News here, we see how tropes such as hoax and hysteria are combined again with to make light of the issue. So if this is Glenn Beck, one of the hosts on Fox News, saying, if you want to buy into this hoax, this theory, give up meat. Wow, it seems like a small price to pay to save the entire planet. And another example also from Fox News, where we see that environmentalism is represented as like disconnected from the needs of interests of everyday Americans, and are linked to representations of climate change as some distant fantasy that is not relevant to Americans today. And the quote says, our cutting edge Democrats want taxes on meat and want humans to eat bugs for the sake of lowering the sea levels in the Maldives in the year 2200. Okay, and so with that, going back to our question, which was which type of arguments are used in climate obstruction, rational or emotional arguments, to conclude, we find that populist appeals to class-based identities, especially appeals that call on resentment against highly educated cultural elites, are one prominent strategy to urge publics to reject climate action. And dietary change as a form of climate action is invoked to delegitimize environmentalists. So there's no rational engagement with this proposal. And the last one, the goal is to construct a dichotomy between ordinary folk and ethically compromised elites that could appeal to class-based identities and stoke resentment towards environmentalists and by proxy towards climate action. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.